Here's how modern luxury retail runs that same playbook inside a single storefront, because I want you to see exactly how deliberately engineered this is. The first tactic is what's sometimes called door control, or informally, the door policy, and it's lifted almost directly from nightclub management, which is not a coincidence because several luxury retail consultants have publicly discussed studying nightclub entry psychology when designing flagship store protocols. A single employee is stationed at the entrance, and their job isn't crowd safety in the way a fire marshal would define it. Their job is pacing. They control the rate at which new customers are allowed to enter, often keeping the number of people inside noticeably below what the store could comfortably hold. Because a store that looks comfortably full doesn't feel exclusive, it just feels busy. And busy is not the emotion luxury retail is selling. The second tactic is the appointment system, which has expanded dramatically across the luxury sector over the last decade, particularly for the most in demand handbag lines. You don't walk in and ask to see a specific bag. You request an appointment, sometimes weeks in advance, and even then, being granted the appointment doesn't guarantee you'll be offered the specific item you actually want. Multiple reports from inside the luxury retail industry describe a practice where sales associates track a client's purchase history, and access to the most desired limited items is quietly reserved for clients who've already proven they're spending loyalty elsewhere in the brand's catalog first. The wait, in this case, isn't measured in minutes on a sidewalk. It's measured in a slow, building relationship with a sales associate that can stretch across months or years before you're even offered the chance to buy the item you originally walked in wanting. The third tactic is deliberately sparse merchandising, and this one is almost invisible unless you know to look for it. Walk into a mid-range clothing retailer and you'll see racks packed tightly with product, dozens of the same shirt in every size because that retailer wants you to see abundance and choice. Walk into a true luxury flagship and you'll often see a handful of items per section, spaced out with almost gallery-like distance between them, sometimes displayed like sculpture rather than merchandise. This isn't because the brand doesn't have more inventory. It's a deliberate visual signal that each item on display is rare enough to deserve its own space, its own lighting, its own moment, and that scarcity of visual density gets psychologically transferred onto the item itself. The same way a single painting on a museum wall reads as more valuable than the same painting crammed into a hallway with 50 others. There's a fourth tactic worth naming directly, because it's the one that surprises people most when they first hear about it. And it's not really about waiting in the physical sense at all. It's about deliberately, repeatedly raising prices on a predictable schedule regardless of underlying cost changes, specifically to reinforce the scarcity narrative from a different angle. Chanel has raised the price of its classic flap handbag multiple times over the past several years, sometimes twice within a single 12-month period, with increases far outpacing general inflation. Publicly, brands frame these increases around rising material costs or currency fluctuations. Internally and in trade press coverage, luxury analysts have described a different logic, sometimes called strategic price escalation, where the increase itself functions as a signal, telling existing and prospective customers that the item is becoming harder to access financially, which triggers the same scarcity heuristic as a physical line. Just measured in dollars instead of minutes, a customer who hesitated to buy last year and watches the price climb again this year experiences a very specific, very profitable emotion, the fear that waiting any longer means never affording access at all. And that fear frequently converts hesitation into a purchase made faster and with less price sensitivity than the customer would have shown under normal circumstances. The wait, in this version, isn't standing outside a door. It's standing on the sidelines of a price that keeps moving upward, specifically because standing on the sidelines is exactly what the brand wants you to feel too anxious to keep doing. Let me give you a short scene to make this concrete, something close to how these conversations actually play out inside a flagship store, based on patterns described repeatedly by former luxury sales associates in interviews and trade publications. A client walks in, having waited 3 weeks for an appointment. She asks about a specific bag she saw a friend carrying. The associate doesn't say no. The associate says, "That style is very difficult right now. We have very limited allocation this season. Let me see what I can do for you." Nothing about that sentence is a lie, and nothing about it is fully true either. The store may have the bag in the back. The associate may have been instructed to offer it only to clients with a certain purchase history first. The client leaves without the bag, but with something the store considers more valuable than a single sale. A client who now believes she has to prove herself through smaller purchases, through repeat visits, through patience to eventually earn access to what she originally walked in wanting. 6 months and several smaller purchases later, she's offered the bag. She buys it instantly at full price with genuine gratitude toward the associate who made it happen for her. She thanks the person who delayed her. That's not an accident of good customer service. That's the entire mechanism working exactly as designed. And it's a large part of why luxury sales associates at the top handbag houses are trained not primarily as salespeople in the traditional sense, but as relationship managers running a long, deliberate campaign of patience and reward. Here's where the story gets a layer more complicated, and this is the part most explanations of luxury psychology skip entirely. The wait doesn't just create desire in the customer standing outside, it creates a completely different psychological state in the customer who eventually gets inside, and that state is what actually drives the extraordinary margins luxury brands run. There's a concept from behavioral economics called effort justification, first demonstrated in classic experiments where people who had to go through an uncomfortable or difficult initiation process to join a group ended up rating that group as significantly more valuable and enjoyable than people who joined the same group easily, with no barrier at all. Your brain doesn't like admitting you suffered for nothing. So when you've stood outside for 40 minutes, when you waited months for an appointment, when you've had to build a relationship with a sales associate over a series of smaller purchases just to be offered the item you actually wanted, your brain retroactively inflates the value of what you finally receive, specifically to justify the effort you put in to get it. The wait isn't just marketing aimed at people outside the store, it's a psychological pre-treatment aimed at the person who eventually walks out with the bag, making them significantly less price sensitive and significantly more emotionally attached to the purchase than if they'd simply bought it off a shelf. Here are the real numbers, because the financial logic behind all of this is not subtle once you see it laid out. The luxury goods conglomerate LVMH, which owns brands including Louis Vuitton, Dior, and dozens of others, has consistently reported gross margins in the range of 60 to 70% across its fashion and leather goods division, margins that would be considered almost fantastical in mainstream retail, where margins in the 20 to 40% range are typical even for well-run brands. Those margins aren't primarily explained by raw material costs. A leather handbag selling for several $1,000s is not several $1,000s more expensive to physically manufacture than a well-made handbag selling for a few $100s. The difference is almost entirely brand value, and brand value in the luxury category specifically is built and protected through exactly the mechanisms we've been walking through: scarcity, controlled access, and the psychological premium created by the weight itself. Hermès has been particularly explicit about this in its own investor communications over the years, describing a deliberate strategy of controlled, limited production for its most iconic bags, famously never fully meeting demand on purpose, because a world where anyone who wants a Birkin can simply walk in and buy one is a world where the Birkin stops being worth what it's currently worth. The waitlist, which for certain Birkin styles has stretched into years, is not a supply chain failure the company is quietly embarrassed about. It is, by the company's own long-term strategy, the product. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this makes sense for handbags and watches, extremely expensive items bought rarely, but does the same psychology really apply to something smaller, something more everyday? And this is where the pattern becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because it's spread far beyond traditional luxury into categories you wouldn't necessarily flag as status goods at all. Sneaker culture is probably the clearest modern example. Limited releases, deliberately restricted quantities, entry through a lottery system rather than a simple purchase, resale markets where a shoe that retailed for $200 trades hands for over $1,000 within days. Nike and Adidas have both built entire release strategies around manufactured scarcity for their collaboration lines, using the same mechanisms as a Paris flagship: an artificial gate on supply, a waiting mechanism that filters and delays access, and a resulting social proof loop where the difficulty of obtaining the item becomes inseparable from its cultural value. High-end restaurants have adopted a version of the same playbook, with reservation systems that release available tables at a specific moment, weeks in advance, creating a mad scramble that functions almost identically to a store's door policy, except the gate opens and closes online instead of on a physical sidewalk. Even certain technology product launches, particularly in the early years of a new smartphone or gaming console, use overnight lines and deliberately constrained initial supply to generate exactly the same social proof and scarcity signaling that Hermes is running on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, just dressed in a hoodie instead of a suit. The streetwear brand Supreme is probably the single clearest case study in existence of this mechanism operating almost in isolation from traditional notions of luxury craftsmanship entirely. Supreme built a billion-dollar valuation largely selling items, t-shirts, hoodies, a branded brick at one point that had comparatively little in raw material or manufacturing costs separating them from ordinary streetwear. What Supreme actually sold was the drop, a weekly release of deliberately tiny quantities of new product, announced with just enough advance notice to generate anticipation, but not enough to let supply ever meaningfully catch up with demand. Items would sell out within minutes, sometimes seconds, of going live, and would immediately reappear on resale markets at 3, 5, sometimes 10 times retail price. Supreme could have simply manufactured more. The company was profitable enough and popular enough that scaling production to meet actual demand was entirely within reach. They chose not to, repeatedly for years, because the founders understood explicitly that the resale markup itself was doing more marketing work than any advertising campaign could, broadcasting scarcity and desirability to an audience far larger than the brand's own customer base entirely for free every week. When Supreme was eventually acquired by VF Corporation in a deal reported around $2 billion and later saw significant valuation write-downs after being sold again, part of the visible strain on the brand came specifically from tension between the parent company's instinct to scale production and satisfy more of the enormous existing demand and the original scarcity strategy that had made the brand valuable in the first place. Scale the supply and you don't just sell more units, you risk quietly dismantling the exact mechanism that made anyone want the units in the first place. This is the trap manufactured scarcity eventually creates for any brand that runs it long enough. The weight isn't just a marketing tool. Over time, it becomes load-bearing, structurally holding up a price and a reputation that a fully open, fully stocked version of the same brand could never support. Here's the part that separates real scarcity from the manufactured kind, and it's a distinction almost no consumer is taught to make. Genuine scarcity exists when a constraint on supply comes from something outside the seller's control, a truly rare material, a production process that simply cannot be scaled without destroying the quality of the item, a genuinely limited natural resource. Manufactured scarcity exists when the constraint is a business decision, reversible at any time, chosen specifically because artificial restriction generates more total revenue and brand equity than simply meeting demand would. The uncomfortable truth is that most of what you experience as scarcity in the luxury and semi-luxury retail world is the second kind, not the first. Hermes has openly discussed the capability to produce significantly more Birkin bags than it currently does. The constraint isn't a shortage of skilled leather workers or a shortage of exotic hides that physically caps production at current levels. The constraint is a strategic choice made because the company's own internal data and decades of pricing history have shown repeatedly that constrained supply generates more long-term value than expanded supply would, even though expanded supply would obviously generate more units sold in the short term. They are choosing lower unit volume in exchange for a permanently higher price ceiling and a permanently more valuable brand. And the weight you experience is the visible tip of that entire strategic iceberg. There's a psychological cost on the other side of this worth naming, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that this system is purely a clever marketing trick with no real consequences. There is documented research on what's sometimes called scarcity-induced anxiety, where the deliberate creation of artificial urgency and limited access measurably increases stress hormones and impulsive decision-making in consumers, leading to purchases people later regret, purchases made not because the item genuinely fit a person's needs or even their taste, but because the fear of missing the narrow window of access overrode their normal decision-making process entirely. This is precisely why flash sales, countdown timers, and phrases like "only 3 left" are so aggressively used not just in luxury retail but across e-commerce broadly. Because the mechanism that makes a waitlist outside Hermes effective is the same mechanism that makes a countdown timer on a random online store effective, an artificially compressed decision window that short circuits the part of your brain that would otherwise pause and ask whether you actually want this thing or whether you just don't want to lose access to it. There's also a quieter, more corrosive effect worth naming directly. The entire system depends on customers competing with each other even when they don't realize they're competing. The waitlist for a rare handbag isn't really a queue. First come, first served, the way a queue at a coffee shop works. It's closer to an informal ranking system based on prior spending, relationship history with a specific sales associate, and sometimes even social media presence, since some luxury brands have been reported to prioritize access for customers with significant online followings, treating them as unpaid advertising channels. This transforms shopping from a simple transaction into a status competition, where the actual prize isn't just the item, it's proof that you ranked highly enough within an invisible hierarchy to be granted access before someone else was. That competitive framing is not an accidental side effect. It's a deliberate structural choice because a customer who believes they're competing for scarce access will tolerate significantly worse treatment, longer waits, and higher prices than a customer who believes they're simply making a purchase. In 2018, a woman in Paris stood outside the Hermes flagship store on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré for 40 minutes on a sidewalk, in a line, just to be let inside a retail store that had visibly empty space on the other side of the glass. She wasn't buying anything rare that day. She wanted a scarf that, in theory, they had plenty of in the back. And yet, the door stayed closed to her for 40 minutes while a single employee stood at the entrance, deciding, one person at a time, who got to come in next. Here's the detail that should bother you. That store was not full. Multiple people who eventually got inside later described entire quiet sections with almost no other customers. The wait had nothing to do with capacity. It had everything to do with a decision made somewhere above the sales floor about what that wait was worth. And once you understand what that decision actually buys the brand, you'll never look at a velvet rope the same way again. I'm going to tell you why luxury stores make you wait, and I promise the real answer has almost nothing to do with crowd control. Here's what's ahead. I'm going to break down the actual psychological mechanism luxury brands are exploiting when they make you stand outside a half-empty store. We'll dig into the economic theory that explains why scarcity, real or completely manufactured, is the single most valuable asset a luxury brand owns. I'll walk you through the specific in-store tactics, from appointment-only shopping to the one-in, one-out door policy that are lifted almost directly from nightclub design, and why that's not a coincidence. And by the end, you'll understand why some of the most profitable retail square footage on the planet is deliberately kept looking, understaffed, undersupplied, and just barely accessible. This isn't a story about rude employees or bad logistics. It's a story about a business model built entirely around making desire more valuable than convenience. And once you see the machinery behind it, you'll notice it everywhere, not just in Paris. Think of a luxury brand's inventory like a lake with a single, narrow outlet. Not a river with the water rushing freely downstream, a lake held back, released only through a small controlled gate. Ordinary retail wants water flowing constantly, because ordinary retail makes its money on volume. More units moving, more revenue, faster. Luxury retail flips that logic almost entirely. The value of what's behind that gate goes up specifically because the gate is narrow. And the moment the brand opens the gate too wide and lets everyone through easily, whenever they want, the water on the other side stops being worth as much. The wait isn't a byproduct of the lake being full. The wait is what keeps the lake valuable in the first place. And every design choice you notice at a luxury flagship, the closed doors, the single greeter, the appointment system, the empty display cases holding almost nothing, exists to protect that narrow gate. The economic theory behind this is almost never explained clearly, and it's where the whole story begins to make sense. Ordinary goods follow what economists call the law of demand. As the price goes up, demand goes down. Simple, intuitive, the way we all assume markets work. But there's a specific category of goods that behaves in almost the opposite way. An economist named it after a 19th century statistician called Robert Giffen, and later refined it through the work of Thorstein Veblen, who studied what he called conspicuous consumption. Veblen goods are products where past a certain point, higher price and reduced accessibility don't hurt demand. They increase it because the price and the difficulty of obtaining the item aren't separate from its value. They are the value. A handbag that costs $800 and is available on a shelf whenever you walk in is a completely different psychological object than the same handbag priced at $12,000, sold only after a 40-minute wait, and offered to you by appointment through a sales associate who implies, without quite saying it, that they had to make a case for you. The waiting isn't friction the brand is failing to remove. The waiting is manufacturing the second product, status, that gets sold alongside the physical one. Here's the first mechanism this creates, and it comes straight out of behavioral economics. There's a well-documented finding called the scarcity heuristic, first formally demonstrated in a series of experiments in the late 1970s where researchers showed that identical cookies placed in a jar with only 2 cookies left compared to a jar with 10 were rated as significantly more desirable and higher quality by test subjects purely because there were fewer of them. Nothing about the cookie changed, only the perceived scarcity changed, and that alone shifted how good people believed the cookie tasted before they'd even bitten into it. Luxury retailers have built an entire physical environment around triggering that exact heuristic deliberately at scale. A closed door with a line outside signals scarcity of access. A nearly empty display case signals scarcity of product. A 40-minute wait signals scarcity of the staff's time and attention. None of these things need to be true in an absolute sense. The stockroom in the back of that Hermes flagship was, by multiple accounts, well stocked. The scarcity being signaled to you on the sidewalk was manufactured specifically for the sidewalk. It exists for your perception, not because the shelves are actually bare. This works so much better on the sidewalk than it would inside a spreadsheet because the psychology gets darker here. There's a concept in social psychology called social proof, and it's the reason a line outside a restaurant makes you more likely to want to eat there, even though logically a long line should just mean a worse, slower experience. Human beings use the visible behavior of other people as a shortcut for judging quality, especially when the thing being judged is hard to evaluate directly, and almost nothing is harder to directly evaluate than luxury goods, where the actual material cost of a handbag or a watch is often a small fraction of its retail price. When you can't easily judge quality from the object itself, you unconsciously judge it from the crowd around it. A line of well-dressed people waiting patiently outside a boutique isn't just an obstacle between you and the door. It's advertising, a walking billboard of desire that the brand didn't have to pay a single dollar to produce, because you and every other person standing in that line built it for them, for free, just by standing there. Before we get into the modern mechanics, I want to show you where this playbook actually came from, because it's older than any handbag brand currently running it, and the history makes the strategy impossible to dismiss as some kind of accidental byproduct of demand. In the 1930s, the diamond company De Beers controlled roughly 90% of the world's rough diamond supply, and they faced a problem that should sound familiar. Diamonds, geologically, are not actually that rare. There was more than enough supply coming out of mines in South Africa and elsewhere to satisfy demand many times over. And if that supply had simply hit the open market, prices would have collapsed the way prices collapse for any abundant commodity. So, De Beers did something that became one of the most studied strategies in the history of marketing. They didn't just sell diamonds, they controlled the release of diamonds into the market, year over year, stockpiling enormous reserves, specifically so supply could never catch up with the demand. They were simultaneously working to manufacture through advertising, most famously through the campaign that produced the phrase, "A diamond is forever," which quietly, brilliantly discouraged the resale market too, because a culture that believes diamonds should never be sold is a culture where secondhand diamonds never flood back into the market to compete with new ones. De Beers wasn't managing a shortage, they were engineering one continuously for decades, and the entire modern luxury industry's relationship with scarcity is, in a very direct sense, downstream of that playbook. Once you know the diamond industry did this on purpose, on a global scale, for the better part of a century, a 40-minute wait outside a boutique in Paris stops looking like an isolated quirk of one brand's culture and starts looking like a well-worn page out of a very old book. So, what do you actually do with all of this? Because understanding the mechanism is only useful if it changes your behavior in the moment you're standing on that sidewalk. First, before you join any wait, whether it's a physical line, an appointment request, or an online queue for a limited release, ask yourself a specific question and be honest about the answer. Would I still want this item if it were sitting on a shelf right now, available immediately, with no line and no wait at all? If the honest answer is no, if part of the appeal is specifically the difficulty of getting it, you're responding to manufactured scarcity, not to the actual object, and that's worth knowing. Before you spend real money justifying an effort you were psychologically pressured into making in the first place. Second, understand the difference between genuine and manufactured scarcity for the specific category you're shopping in, because that distinction changes what the weight is actually protecting. A truly limited natural material, a hand-numbered piece from a small workshop, these reflect real constraints. A major fashion house's flagship handbag line, deliberately capped in production despite documented capacity to produce more, reflects a business strategy. And knowing that difference should change how much psychological weight you assign to finally getting access. Third, give yourself a mandatory cooling off period on any purchase that involved a significant wait, whether that's a physical line, an appointment, or a countdown timer online. Effort justification is strongest in the moment right after the barrier is cleared and weakest after even a single day of distance from that moment. If the desire survives 24 hours away from the excitement of finally being let in, it was probably a genuine preference. If it fades once the artificial urgency is removed, you now know exactly what you were actually buying, and it wasn't the object. Fourth, pay attention to who benefits from your patience, not just whether you eventually got what you wanted. If a sales associate is building a relationship with you specifically by withholding access and offering it slowly across a series of smaller purchases, recognize that pattern for what it is: a deliberate retention and upsell strategy, not a personal favor you owe gratitude for. You are allowed to ask directly whether an item is actually unavailable or simply not being offered to you yet, and you're allowed to walk away from a brand that treats access as something to be earned through unrelated spending rather than something to be sold plainly. Fifth, separate the price increase from the value increase before you let rising prices push you into a purchase. A predictable, repeated price hike on the same item, unconnected to any real change in materials or craftsmanship, is a scarcity signal aimed at your fear of future exclusion, not new information about the object's actual worth. And recognizing that distinction can save you from buying today out of anxiety about tomorrow, which is precisely the emotional trigger the strategy is built to create. Here's the identity level point I want you to leave with. The wait outside a luxury store isn't rudeness, and it isn't poor operational planning by a company that can clearly afford better staffing. It's one of the most carefully engineered psychological tools in modern retail, built on real, well-documented research into scarcity, social proof, and effort justification, deployed specifically to make you value what's on the other side of that door more than you would if the door had simply been open. Understanding this doesn't mean you can never enjoy a genuinely well-made luxury item again, and it doesn't mean every wait is manipulative in a sinister sense. It means you get to decide consciously whether the wait is adding real information about scarcity you should respect, or whether it's simply a lever being pulled on a part of your brain that evolved long before shopping malls existed, a part of your brain that still, on some level, reads scarcity as safety and access as status, whether or not that reading has anything to do with the actual quality of what's behind the glass. Here are your 3 takeaways. 1. The wait outside a luxury store is very often manufactured rather than genuine, a deliberate business strategy documented by the companies themselves, designed to trigger the scarcity heuristic and drive up perceived value, not a natural consequence of limited stock or overwhelmed staff. 2. The psychological mechanism at work. Effort justification means the harder you had to work to get access, the more your own mind will inflate the value of what you finally receive, which is precisely why brands protect and extend that difficulty rather than removing it, even when removing it would be operationally easy and would sell more units in the short term. 3. Protect your own decision-making with a simple test before any high-stakes purchase involving scarcity or a wait. Ask whether you'd still want the item without the line, and give yourself real distance from the moment of access before you spend, because the excitement of finally being let in is precisely the moment your judgment is least reliable, and precisely the moment the entire system was built to exploit. The next time you see a line outside a boutique with visibly empty space behind the glass, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Not a store that's struggling to keep up with demand. A company that has run the numbers, studied the psychology, and decided that your patience on that sidewalk is worth more to them than your convenience ever could be. If this changed the way you'll look at the next velvet rope you walk past, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.